Hey y'all, welcome to T's Thoughts, where we nourish our souls through in-depth Bible study. Y'all, today we are in lesson 3 of our January Bible study. And so I want you to grab your Bible and turn to Genesis chapter 16. Get your favorite pen and your journal and get you some highlighters, and let's study Genesis chapter 16. Alright guys, so today we are in lesson 3 of our January Bible study. If you have not watched lesson 1 and lesson 2, go and watch those, because that'll give us some foundation. It'll give you, I think we talked about Noah in lesson 2. In lesson 1 we gave a foundation of Genesis, and in lesson 2 we talked about Noah, and then today we are going to talk about Hagar in chapter 16. So I want to pull out Genesis 16 and 13, but I want you to, we're going to dissect the whole chapter, but 13 is what stood out to me. And so I want to read that, and then we're going to go through each of the verses in chapter 16. So Genesis 16 and 13 says, So she named the Lord who spoke to her, You are El Roi. For she said, In this place have I actually seen the one who sees me. Y'all, Lord have mercy. That right there blessed me. I'm going to read it again. Genesis 16 and 13. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, You are El Roi. For she said, In this place have I actually seen the one who sees me. Y'all, aren't you glad that the Lord sees you? I'm not going to go ahead of myself. Let's go and let's look at verses 1 through 4. Right, so in this, let me give you a little context. So we're in chapter 16 with Hagar and Ishmael. Now, before we see Abram, now remember, God had promised Abram and Sarah a child. But they were up in some years and they still had not had a child. So in verses 1 through 4, it says, Abram's wife Sarai had not borne any children for him, but she owned an Egyptian slave named Hagar. And so Sarai decides that since she has not borne a child, she was getting frustrated and in her waiting with God. And so she decided, take Hagar, Abram, let her become your wife, and she will bear us a child. Okay, so this is what 1 through 4 says. She says, Sarah said to Abram, Since the Lord has prevented me from bearing children, go to my slave. Perhaps through her I can build a family. And Abram agreed to what Sarah said. So Sarah decides to take things into her own hands and go and said, here, God hasn't given me a child yet, and so you take Hagar and then she'll bear a child for us. But that's not what God told Sarah. That's not what God said to Abram. This was Abram and Sarai's plan. So despite knowing the promises that God had given to them, she comes up with her own plan to try to help God out and to satisfy her own satisfaction. But remember, they were old. They were without a child. And back in those days, having a child was everything, because you wanted to have an heir, especially a male child. You wanted to have an heir for your family. So she takes Hagar. So the plan was to take Hagar as a wife and to have a child. And so this is where we are. And so we find ourselves that Hagar goes to Abram. Abram sleeps with Hagar, and Hagar becomes pregnant. Y'all, it's a lot going on. It is a lot going on in this matter because, we see again that was not God's plan. And when we go outside of God's plan, it makes a mess. It is a mess. And we're going to see the mess that it stirs up. Let's go to 4 and 6. So he slept with Hagar and she became pregnant. When she saw that she was pregnant, her mistress became contemptible to her. Then Sarah told Abram, now look at the mess, it's starting already. You are responsible for my suffering. I put my slave in your arms, and when she saw that she was pregnant, I became contemptible to her. May the Lord judge between me and you. Now, Sarah, it was Sarah's plan, right? Abram went with the plan. Just, what does that sound like? Adam and Eve. Eve goes and eat the fruit. They knew they weren't supposed to eat the fruit. Adam goes and eats the fruit with Sarah and with Eve, instead of Adam saying, no, this is not what God said. Abram, this is not what God said. God said he was going to give us a child. No, I'm not going to sleep with Hagar. But no, he did. He slept with Hagar. Well, then she becomes pregnant. Hagar decides, oh, I'm better than you, Sarah, because I'm pregnant and I have your husband's child and you don't have a child. Now, that's what they said. I'm ad-libbing here. But it was contempt. It was a lot of it was pretty bad. It was messy. It was very, very messy. So Hagar becomes pregnant. Then Sarah starts mistreating Hagar because she was jealous. Who wouldn't be? Your womb is empty. God has promised you something, and you thought that this was going to satisfy you. How many times have we decided to make our plans thinking that this is going to satisfy us when God has already said a thing, but we move outside of God's timing and his plan? It was not God's will for Abram to have a child with Hagar. It was God's will for Abram to have a child with Sarah in the right time. But we know when we are waiting on a thing, and we've been waiting and we've been waiting, and we're like, Lord, when is it going to happen? When is this thing going to come to fruition? I'm getting old. I am weary. I am tired. And what does it come out? She decided to take matters into her own hands. And so she took matters into her own hands, and then she became jealous of the woman who she gave to her husband. That's, y'all know, we ain't playing that now. I'm not giving you somebody else in order to satisfy my emptiness. Come on. That was never going to satisfy Sarah. She was still going to be empty. And that was not going to be the child that Hagar was carrying. Sometimes they would use the slaves and then they would bear child and then they would be like surrogates almost. But this was not going to be like that because that wasn't coming out of Sarah's womb. It wasn't coming out of her. That was Hagar and Abram's child, not the child that God had promised them. Okay, so sometimes don't move out of convenience. Don't move out of impatientness when you're impatient or out of pain. Sometimes we make some bad decisions when we move out of pain. Come on. We move out of pain, and that is not, and God does not want us to move out of pain and go outside of his will. Okay, so that is what was happening there. Let's go to verse 7 through 11. So the angel of the Lord found her. So Sarah had mistreated her so much that she ran away from her. Talking about Hagar. Sarah had mistreated Hagar, and so Hagar runs away. So now we find where the angel of the Lord comes and he finds Hagar by a spring in the wilderness, the spring on the way to Shur. He said, Hagar, slave of Sarai, where have you come from and where are you going? She replied, I'm running away from my mistress, Sarah. The angel of the Lord said to her, go back to your mistress and submit to her authority. The angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count. Too many to count. Then the angel of the Lord said to her, you have conceived and will have a son. You will name him Ishmael, for the Lord has heard your cry of affliction. So God heard Hagar's cry. And so Hagar runs away, right? She runs away due to the cruelty that she was receiving, and so she runs away. But the angel of the Lord came to her and told her to go back. Told her to go back to where she was going. Now, I wonder, like, why did the angel of the Lord tell her to go back to a place that she was treated badly and harshly? Where was she going? Come on. When you don't... It's almost like what's back at home, God's going to work it out back at home. Because where I'm going, I have no clue. And it could be worse for me where we're going. He also promised that the child in her womb would be a son. Not only that, but God called his name Ishmael, which means God hears. She had a promise. Although this baby, this situation was not God's will, he took that and he said, I'm gonna work it out for you. Right? Go back home. Do what you were supposed to do. And God hears. And he gave her a promise, an acknowledgement, that a prophecy, your son is gonna be Ishmael, and I'm going to multiply him. I'm going to multiply your family through Ishmael. Go back. Come on. Sometimes, Lord have mercy, we got to go back and get things and settle and stay in God's will. I know sometimes it's hard because you're like, God, what's behind me? Woo, I'm being mistreated. But God has a plan for you. And no, God does not want you to be mistreated. God does not. Hagar. So the angel of the Lord comes, tells her to go back home. And so, but God had gave her a prophecy and told her, I'm going to give you a son. His name is going to be Ishmael. And you're going to multiply. God was going to multiply her and pretty much settle her in this situation. And the name Ishmael means God hears. So those who were close to Hagar had turned their backs on her, and she felt completely alone. But God, with his good self, came close to her, reassuring her that he had heard her despair. And not only we're going to see did he hear her despair, he saw her. Let's go to 12. The man, and so this is what it said about verse 12. It says, this man will be like a wild donkey. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. He will settle near all his relatives. So she named the Lord, this is the verse. So she named the Lord who spoke to her, you are Elroy, for she said, in this place I have actually seen the one who sees me. That is why the well is called Beer-lahai-roi. It's between Kadesh and Bered. So Hagar gave birth to Abram's son, and Abram named his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. 86 years old. Come on, y'all. They've been waiting. So Hagar goes back. Let's talk about verse 12 for a minute. Said this man would be like a wild donkey. His hand would be against everyone, and everyone's hands would be against him. He will settle near all his relatives. Now, Ishmael means God hears. And now this one, it said God hears will be like a wild donkey. His descendants will be unruly, bringing conflict into the house of God for generations to come. Later, if you continue on, you'll see the Ishmaelites. Those were Ishmael's descendants. Ishmael's descendants became the Ishmaelites, right? But it says that although, and it seems like that is like a weird prophecy, because yes, he said, now look at verse 10. He said, the angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your offspring, and they will be too many to count. He's going to build this people, but then these people, almost like it was almost like Ishmael was going to grow up and be like a warrior or like a wild person. And like, is that a prophecy you want about your kid, that it would be like a wild donkey, you know? But in that, Hagar saw, he said, God heard, God hears, God sees. And so she named that place, she said, Elroy, this is where God sees me, right? He sees her. And so even in what could be taken as a negative prophecy about their child, you said, still, God's going to handle it. God's going to be there with me. God sees me in this situation. You hear Ishmael, you'll hear Ishmael's name again, which I said would be the Ishmaelites, and they would be a constant nemesis to the Jews. Sarah's plan only led to conflict. It didn't lead to what she thought it was going to be. She still didn't have a child. There was conflict between her and Hagar. And then this child is coming into play who wasn't supposed, that situation wasn't supposed to happen, but God took it, tried to make something good out of it. But in the middle of it, God sees this lady. God sees her and tells her, I'm going to take care of it. In spite of what Hagar had just heard about her son's future, her response is one of gratitude because God saw her and helped her. The fact that God saw her was enough. God saw her in a harsh situation, sent her back, because later we don't see where Hagar was treated harshly anymore during that scene. But as we continue on, there's situations that happen. But God still took care of Ishmael. He made him he multiplied him. And we'll see that later in Genesis, and where Abram took care of them. But there comes a time when you make your own plan and your own will, where there's going to have to be a separation between the two, because those two women can't stay together. No. They can't stay together, and there's got to be a separation. But when we go outside of God's will, it causes conflict, it causes turmoil. So what we get out of this, one, God hears, God sees, and God cares. Okay? Also, we can't take things into our own hands. When God sets a promise, right, we have to wait patiently on God's promise. Wait until He brings it to pass, not where we take it upon ourselves and go left and God said, stay here because I'm going to take you right. You see what I'm saying? Because when we do it like Sarah did, it's a whole lot of stuff going on. And we don't need that. It was like unnecessary pain. But what she thought she was doing was going to satisfy her barrenness. And the only thing that could satisfy her barrenness was for her to produce a child in God's timing. Sarah, produce. You produce. You produce the purpose. You produce what God has laid into your hands in His timing. Okay? Stop adding other people and adding things into what God has not told you to do. All right? Because we don't need wild donkeys going around and doing all that stuff. So, was one where God heard. God heard him. God heard his mom's cry. And he was a reminder that God heard her in her time of affliction. Okay? All right, guys. That is it for chapter 16. I pray that God will hear your cry. Know that God hears your cry. Know that God sees you. Know that God cares for you. And that in his time, his promise shall come to pass. Why? Because he is not a man that he shall lie, or the son of man that he will repent. What he said is going to happen. His promises are yes and amen. So believe God today. God hears, God sees, and God cares. All right, guys, until next week, be kind to yourself, be kind to someone else, and have a grace-filled week. I'll see you next week. Bye.